The weight of my violin case pulled at my shoulder as I navigated through the opulent ballroom of the Drake Hotel, my black dress a stark contrast against the sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. The annual Chicago Elite Charity Gala was in full swing, with crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across marble floors that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. I wasn't supposed to be here as a guest. I was the hired entertainment, scheduled to perform a 30-minute set during dinner. My fingers traced the familiar curve of my violin case's handle, a nervous habit I'd developed over years of performances. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the orchestra tuning their instruments in the corner. Wealthy socialites mingled with business moguls, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings, while servers in crisp white uniforms glided between them with champagne flutes. I found my designated spot near the grand piano, a small raised platform that would give me visibility over the crowd without making me the center of attention. Perfect. The last thing I wanted was to draw unnecessary notice from Chicago's elite. My father, Judge Robert Morrison, had always warned me about getting too close to the powerful families that dominated this city's social scene. Some of those smiles hide very sharp teeth, Juliet. He'd told me just last week when I'd mentioned tonight's performance. Play your music, collect your fee, and come straight home. As I unpacked my violin, the familiar ritual calmed my nerves. The Stradivarius, a family heirloom passed down from my grandmother, gleamed under the lights. Its rich, honey-colored wood had witnessed decades of performances, but tonight it seemed to tremble in my hands with anticipation. The ballroom's acoustics were incredible. I tested a few notes, letting the sound carry across the space, and noticed several heads turn in my direction. Good. That meant they'd actually listen when I began my formal performance. I'd chosen a selection of classical pieces that would complement the evening's sophisticated atmosphere without overwhelming the conversation. A server approached with a glass of champagne, which I politely declined. I never drank before a performance. It dulled the precision I needed for complex passages. Besides, I wasn't here to socialize. This was work, and I needed to remain professional. The crowd's energy shifted suddenly, conversations quieting as someone entered through the main ballroom doors. I glanced up from tuning my violin to see what had captured everyone's attention. A man in an impeccably tailored black tuxedo moved through the crowd with the kind of confidence that commanded respect, or fear. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair slicked back and piercing eyes that seemed to catalog every person in the room. People stepped aside for him without being asked. Women's gazes lingered as he passed, while men straightened their spines and offered respectful nods. This wasn't just wealth walking through the room. This was power. Raw, undiluted power that made my instincts prickle with warning. I forced myself to look away and focus on my preparations. Whatever drama was unfolding in Chicago's social hierarchy wasn't my concern. I was here to play violin, nothing more. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator's voice crackled through the sound system. Please welcome our evening's musical entertainment, Miss Juliet Morrison. The spotlight found me as polite applause rippled through the crowd. I positioned my violin beneath my chin, raised my bow, and let the first haunting notes of Pachelbel's canon fill the ballroom. The familiar melody wrapped around me like a protective cocoon, transporting me away from the watchful eyes and into the pure space where only music existed. I moved through my repertoire with practiced ease, Bach's Air on the G-string, followed by a passionate rendition of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons. The crowd had returned to their conversations, but I could feel their appreciation in the way the room's energy shifted with each piece. This was what I lived for, the moment when music transcended mere entertainment and became something transcendent. As I transitioned into the final piece, Mozart's Violin Sonata No. 21, I became aware of a particular intensity in the room's atmosphere. It felt like being watched by a predator. My eyes swept the crowd during a brief instrumental pause and locked onto the same dark-haired man from earlier. He stood near the bar, a crystal tumbler in his hand, his attention fixed entirely on me. The scrutiny should have made me nervous, but instead it sparked something defiant in my chest. I'd performed for audiences far more intimidating than one well-dressed man at a charity gala. I lifted my chin slightly and poured every ounce of passion into the final movement, letting the violin sing with a clarity that made several conversations pause mid-sentence. When the last note faded, the applause was genuinely enthusiastic. I took a modest bow and began packing my instrument, grateful that my obligation was complete. The fee from tonight's performance would cover my rent for the next 2 months and leave enough for groceries. Not glamorous, but sufficient. That was extraordinary. The voice came from directly behind me, smooth and cultured with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I turned to find the dark-haired man standing closer than I'd expected, his presence somehow more overwhelming up close. This near, I could see that his eyes were an unusual shade of green, like sea glass, and there was a small scar running along his left temple that suggested his life hadn't been entirely sheltered. "Thank you," I replied politely, continuing to pack my violin. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." "James Salvatore," he said, extending a hand. The name meant nothing to me, but something in his tone suggested it should. "And you are far too talented to be playing background music at charity events." I accepted his handshake briefly, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the way his suit had been tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders. "Juliet Morrison, and I'm perfectly content with my career choices, thank you." His smile widened at my response, as if my slight coolness amused rather than offended him. "I'm sure you are. Tell me, Miss Morrison, do you dance as beautifully as you play?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced around the ballroom, where couples had indeed begun moving onto the dance floor, as the orchestra struck up a waltz. Several women nearby were watching our conversation with poorly concealed interest and what looked like envy. "I prefer to observe rather than participate," I said carefully. Something about James Salvatore set off warning bells in my mind. Maybe it was the way people kept glancing in our direction, or how the very air seemed to change when he moved through it. "Pity," he murmured, stepping slightly closer. "I was hoping you might honor me with a dance." The request was phrased politely, but there was an underlying expectation in his voice, as if he wasn't accustomed to being refused. The women within earshot were staring openly now, and I caught several whispered conversations that seemed to center on shock that James Salvatore was speaking to the hired entertainment. "I appreciate the invitation," I said, securing my violin case's latches with more force than necessary. "But I don't dance with strangers. If you'll excuse me, I have another engagement this evening." The lie came easily. My only engagement was with a cup of tea and a book in my apartment. But something about this man made me want to establish distance immediately. His expression flickered. Surprise, followed by what might have been amusement or annoyance. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Perhaps another time." I nodded politely and gathered my things, acutely aware that our entire exchange had been observed by what felt like half the ballroom. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel his gaze following me like a physical weight between my shoulder blades. The cool October air outside the hotel was a relief after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. I pulled my coat tighter and hailed a taxi, eager to put distance between myself and whatever undercurrents I'd stumbled into tonight. Some instinct told me that refusing James Salvatore's invitation had been the right choice, even if I couldn't articulate exactly why. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the hotel's entrance. James Salvatore stood silhouetted against the warm light spilling from the ballroom, his hands in his pockets, watching my departure with an expression I couldn't read. Something cold settled in my stomach as our eyes met through the taxi's rear window. I had the distinct feeling that this wouldn't be the last time our paths crossed, and that thought terrified me more than I cared to admit. I woke to the sound of my apartment building's front door buzzing incessantly. Groggily, I checked my phone, 6:47 a.m. Who could possibly be visiting this early on a Sunday morning? The buzzing continued, sharp and demanding, echoing through my small one-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park. Wrapping my robe around me, I padded to the intercom by my front door. "Hello? Miss Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "Delivery for you." I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything, and deliveries didn't typically arrive on Sunday mornings. "What kind of delivery?" "Floral arrangement, very large. Should I bring it up?" Still confused, but not wanting to leave someone standing in the cold October morning, I buzzed them up. Through my peephole, I watched a delivery man struggle up the stairs with what appeared to be an enormous bouquet of white roses, at least 3 dozen of them, arranged in an elaborate crystal vase that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "These are for Juliet Morrison?" he confirmed when I opened the door. "Yes, but I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake, ma'am. Sign here, please." Or, the bouquet dominated my small living room once he'd positioned it on my coffee table. The roses were perfect, their petals just beginning to open, and their fragrance filled the entire apartment. Tucked among the stems was a small card in heavy cream stock. "Thank you for the performance last night. Your talent deserves a more appreciative audience. J.S." My hands trembled slightly as I read the card. James Salvatore had somehow discovered where I lived and sent flowers that probably cost more than I made in a week. The gesture should have been flattering, but instead it felt invasive. How had he gotten my address? I was careful about my privacy, especially given my father's position as a federal judge. I set the card aside and tried to push down the unease creeping up my spine. Perhaps it was just an extravagant thank you from someone who genuinely appreciated classical music. Wealthy people sometimes made grand gestures without thinking about how they might be perceived. But as I made coffee and tried to settle into my normal Sunday routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Twice, I caught myself checking the windows of my third-floor apartment, scanning the street below for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place, just the typical Lincoln Park morning with joggers and dog walkers moving along the tree-lined sidewalks. My phone rang as I was reading the Sunday Tribune, making me jump and spill coffee on the arts section. "Juliet, you sound tense." My father's voice carried his usual note of concern. Judge Robert Morrison had an uncanny ability to detect when something was troubling me. "Just tired from last night's performance," I said, not wanting to worry him with what was probably nothing more than an overly enthusiastic admirer. "How did the gala go?" "I hope the city's elite treated you with appropriate respect." I hesitated, thinking of James Salvatore's intense green eyes and the way the entire ballroom had seemed to revolve around his presence. "It was fine. Standard charity event. The acoustics were excellent." "Good, good. You know how I worry about you performing at those sorts of gatherings. Some of the families who attend." He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. Chicago's wealthiest circles often intersected with less savory elements of the city's power structure. "Dad, do you know anyone named James Salvatore?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Where did you hear that name?" "He was at the gala last night. We spoke briefly after my performance." Another pause. "Juliet, I want you to listen to me very carefully. James Salvatore is not someone you want to have any association with. If he contacts you again, you call me immediately. Do you understand?" My father's tone sent ice through my veins. In all my 25 years, I'd rarely heard him speak with such grave seriousness. "Dad, what aren't you telling me? Just promise me you'll be careful. And if anything unusual happens, anything at all, you call me right away." After we hung up, I stared at the white roses dominating my living room with new eyes. My father's reaction confirmed what my instincts had been screaming since last night. James Salvatore was dangerous in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I spent the rest of the morning researching his name online, but found surprisingly little concrete information. There were mentions in society pages, photographs from various charity events and business functions, but nothing that explained the fear I'd heard in my father's voice. James Salvatore appeared to be a successful businessman with interests in real estate and hospitality, nothing more. Yet the lack of detailed information was telling in itself. In the age of social media and digital footprints, most people left extensive trails. The fact that James Salvatore's online presence was so carefully curated suggested significant resources and motivation to control his public image. Around noon, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. I hope you enjoyed the roses. Perhaps we could discuss your next performance over dinner tonight. James. My hands shook as I read the message. He had my phone number now, too. The walls of my apartment suddenly felt thin and vulnerable, as if his presence could penetrate them through sheer will. I didn't respond to the text, hoping that silence would convey disinterest. Instead, I tried to lose myself in practice, pulling out my violin and working through some challenging Paganini exercises that required total concentration. The familiar discipline of technical work usually calmed my mind, but today, even the music couldn't quite dispel the growing sense of unease. The afternoon passed quietly enough that I began to convince myself I was overreacting. Perhaps James Salvatore was simply a wealthy man unaccustomed to being refused, and my father's reaction was just protective paranoia. I made a simple dinner and settled in with a book, determined to treat this as a normal Sunday evening. At 8 o'clock, my building's front door buzzer rang again. This time, I didn't answer it. The buzzing continued for nearly 5 minutes before stopping, leaving my apartment in tense silence. I crept to my window and peered down at the street, but saw nothing unusual, just empty sidewalks under the golden glow of streetlights. My phone buzzed with another text. I know you're home, Juliet. We need to talk. The use of my first name, the certainty in his words, made my heart race. I double-checked that my apartment door was locked and considered calling the police. But what would I tell them? A man had sent me flowers and asked me to dinner? That hardly constituted a crime. 20 minutes later, a soft knock came at my door. Not the building's front entrance, but my actual apartment door. Someone had gotten inside the building. Miss Morrison? The voice was different from this morning's delivery man, deeper with a slight accent. Mr. Salvatore would like a word. I backed away from the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a dark suit, his hands clasped in front of him in a stance that suggested military or security training. I'm not available, I called through the door, proud that my voice remained steady. He's waiting in the car downstairs. Just 5 minutes of your time. Please leave or I'll call the police. There was a pause, then the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. I waited by the door for several minutes before cautiously checking the peephole again. The hallway was empty, but when I looked out my window, I could see a black sedan parked directly across from my building. The windows were tinted, but I had no doubt who was inside. I called my father. Juliet, what's wrong? James Salvatore is outside my building. He sent someone to my door asking me to come down and talk to him. The curse my father let slip was one I'd never heard from him before. Are you safe? Is your door locked? Yes. But Dad, how did he find my apartment? How did he get my phone number? Men like Salvatore have resources most people can't imagine. Listen to me carefully. You're going to pack a bag and come stay at the house for a few days. I can't just run away because some man sent me flowers and asked me to dinner. This isn't about flowers, Juliet. James Salvatore is connected to the Torino crime family. He's dangerous in ways you can't possibly understand. The words hit me like a physical blow. Crime family. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The way people had reacted to him at the gala, the deference and fear, the careful distance others had maintained. "I'll pack now," I whispered. "No, don't leave the apartment tonight. It's not safe to move in the dark. First thing in the morning, I'll send someone to escort you." After my father hung up, I sat in my darkened living room, afraid to turn on too many lights and reveal my presence to whoever might be watching from the street below. The white roses seemed to mock me from the coffee table, their beauty now sinister in the shadows. Every sound from the building made me jump. Footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the ancient heating system's groans and sighs. I dozed fitfully in my chair, unwilling to go to my bedroom where I'd feel more vulnerable. Just before dawn, I heard the soft rumble of a car engine starting. When I cautiously checked the window, the black sedan was gone, but tucked under my door was a single white rose with another note in that same heavy cream stock. "You can't hide forever, beautiful. We will dance eventually." J.S. The safe house my father had arranged turned out to be a modest cabin in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, about 2 hours north of Chicago. Detective Sarah Chen, a family friend who worked closely with federal law enforcement, had driven me there early Monday morning while my father pulled strings to ensure the location remained confidential. "This is temporary," Detective Chen assured me as we pulled up the gravel drive. "Just until we can figure out exactly what Salvatore wants and how to handle it legally." The cabin was rustic but comfortable, surrounded by tall pines that would provide cover from prying eyes. It had been used before to house witnesses and had basic security measures in place. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe without looking over my shoulder. But isolation brought its own challenges. With nothing but my violin and my thoughts for company, I found myself obsessing over every detail of my encounter with James Salvatore. Had I somehow encouraged his attention? Was there something I'd said or done that made him believe I was interested? On Wednesday evening, as I was practicing near the cabin's large front window, I noticed headlights turning up the drive. My heart hammered against my ribs until I recognized Detective Chen's unmarked sedan. She wasn't alone. A second car followed behind her. "We need to talk," Chen said when I opened the door. "There's been a development." The man who emerged from the second car was someone I didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired, wearing the kind of expensive overcoat that suggested significant authority. His pale blue eyes assessed me with sharp intelligence as Chen made introductions. "Juliet Morrison, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brennan. He's heading up a federal investigation that your situation has become relevant to." Brennan's handshake was firm, but brief. "Miss Morrison, I understand you've been having some unwanted attention from James Salvatore." We settled around the cabin's small dining table, and Brennan opened a briefcase filled with photographs and documents. The first image he placed in front of me was a surveillance photo of James Salvatore, entering what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. "For the past 18 months, we've been building a RICO case against the Torino crime family," Brennan explained. "James Salvatore is Vincent Torino's right-hand man and presumed heir to the organization. He's also one of the most dangerous men in Chicago." He spread out more photographs. James at various business meetings, entering buildings, speaking with men whose faces had been circled in red ink. He oversees their money laundering operations through a network of legitimate businesses. Restaurants, nightclubs, real estate development. All very profitable, all very illegal. My mouth felt dry as I studied the images. This was the man who had asked me to dance, who had sent roses to my apartment. Why is he interested in me? "That's what we're trying to figure out," Chen said. "Your father thinks it might be connected to his position on the federal bench. Judge Morrison has been assigned to several cases involving organized crime figures over the past few years." Brennan leaned forward, his expression grave. "There's something else you need to know. 3 days ago, Vincent Torino was shot outside his restaurant in Little Italy. He's in intensive care, and there's significant doubt about whether he'll survive." The implications hit me immediately. Which means James Salvatore is about to become much more powerful. Exactly. And historically, men in his position consolidate power through strategic alliances. Sometimes that involves marriage into other influential families. Brennan's gaze was direct and unflinching. Your father is one of the most respected federal judges in the Northern District of Illinois. A connection to his family would provide Salvatore with significant legitimacy and protection. I stood abruptly, needing to pace. You're saying he might be targeting me as some sort of political marriage arrangement? It's one theory, Chen said gently. The other possibility is that he's genuinely attracted to you and isn't accustomed to being refused. Men like Salvatore don't hear no very often. Either way, Brennan continued, you're in a precarious position. We've intercepted communications suggesting that Salvatore has been asking questions about your schedule, your habits, your security arrangements. The cabin's cozy warmth suddenly felt stifling. I moved to the window, staring out at the dark forest beyond. What do you want from me? Your cooperation, Brennan said simply. We're close to having enough evidence to bring down the entire Torino organization, but we need more documentation of their financial operations. If Salvatore continues pursuing you, it might provide an opportunity to get someone inside his inner circle. I turned to face them, incredulous. You want me to spy on him? We want you to be our eyes and ears if the situation develops naturally, Chen clarified. You wouldn't be asked to actively seek out information or put yourself in danger. But if he continues his pursuit, any intelligence you could provide might help us protect other innocent people from his organization's influence. The weight of their request settled on my shoulder.